applied to when you do the first assignment in a way of analysing how both projects hit the ground, how it deals with mass. And I just quote, "Space that results from placing figures or elements should be considered as carefully as the figures themselves. That the detail of the volume's form is worth understanding, but also worth analysing, is the effect of the negative space created from the location of these blocks or form." So the continuous circulation in vowels or the garden created within the Moriyama house. So I hope this gives you an insight into the two different approaches to manipulating this technique and looking at materiality, circulation, threshold, structure. So starting with Peter Zumthor's vowels. Peter Zumthor, the architect that worked on Wahl's thermal baths and considered one of the most iconic buildings in Swiss contemporary architecture. And in 1998, just 2 years after its opening, it became a national monument. And just a sort of preamble to this, I've visited this building. I've actually been to this part of Switzerland. And I definitely encourage you to visit this part of Switzerland. I've done a bit of travelling, but within Europe, there's only a few places that I've visited where you go to the Tourist Information Centre and they provide you with a plan or a map of the town locating all the architect's work. So he's a modern, contemporary architect, but people travel to this part of Switzerland just to see his work. A lot of his buildings are accessible to the public, so museums, galleries, this particular building. Almost on the same level of going to Barcelona to see Gaudi's work. So I've been to visit, and when we first arrived, we actually approach it from the outside. Actually, what I'll do is I'll talk about the history. Okay. Sorry, that's what I was going to say as well. When you're doing your archi touring around, you tend to spend a lot of time behind the lens of a camera, taking photographs. Whereas this particular building, you're not allowed to take the camera in. It's a bathhouse, so people are wandering around in their bathers. So this building is really about sitting there, remembering that moment in time. Having that time to pause and interact with the building and not be distracted by objects and taking photographs. And you're just able to sit there and understand the sort of hidden traits and the intent planted there by the architect. So the setting, it's up in the Central Alps of Switzerland. There's one winding road in and out, and it's located 1,200 metres above sea level. And the valley sort of opens up, and you see these rough stone roofs, and quite different to other parts of the Swiss Alps where there's a lot of use of timber. The reason there's a lot of stone used in this actual village is because they quarry quartzite in that location. And so they've utilised it in all the vernacular architecture within the village. The other thing that's unique to this village is there's a spring water, a warm 30 degrees, and it has been known as a spa town for many years. And the 1960s hotel was sort of built around that spring, and that's what you can see in that photo. Halfway up is the 1960s hotel. Partway through, it went bankrupt, and the village formed a group to buy back the hotel, take control of the complex, the spring complex, the bath complex, and the brief was set by the town for a new bathhouse. And the major thing in the brief was that it could be built in a way that wouldn't detract or block the view of the 1960s hotel. So this photo, you can see the grey building halfway down is the new Wahl's building, and sitting behind it is the original 1960s hotel that still has a view across the valley. So this next series of photos is how you approach the building. So you park the car down at the lower level, and you can see there isn't a door, it's just a series of windows that are carved into the monolithic building. Windows that don't reveal what's behind. And some of these are my photographs. And what we did when we first arrived was, instead of just going and trying to find this discrete entry into this building, we scampered around the perimeter of it, quite a steep embankment. So you come up this steep pathway, approaching this building, not sure of its entry. And as you come up that embankment, you find there's this grass roof, but still no entry. The grass roof sort of morphs with the mountain. And eventually, as you come back down that hill, the outdoor pool starts to reveal itself. But you're still not able to access the bathhouse at this point. You're still an outsider. Okay. So Peter Zumthor, a local architect, won the project, and he started the idea of mapping the quarry with a series of diagrams. So this is his early sketches up the top, using charcoal. And these diagrams started to form the blocks in plan. So this is obviously what it ends up being, but that's where the early sketches started. So the early sketch and iteration is about dissecting that quarry, drawing on ideas of the village and the mountain and going into the mountain. And the charcoal drawings play around with the notion of stone blocks in water. What does it mean to open up the quarry? What happens where the seams and the cracks occur? What happens when the water is allowed to flow through it? What happens when some stones are quarried, so the subtractive removed, and other blocks remain standing, the additive? The architect also had the desire that ultimately the building would be part of everyday life, so timeless, like it had always been part of the landscape, part of the mountain. So drawing on the palette and materials from the town, the use of local stone, the quartzite, was employed to clad the building, and the challenge was staying disciplined to the use of stone for the floor and walls and ceiling. And as to quote Peter Zumthor, mountain, stone, water, the idea of building in stone, building with stone, into the mountain, building out of the mountain. So whilst the use of one key material could seem dull and austere, the introduction of water and the contact with water and the changing patina of the stone, glistening reflection, gave the stone life. And it's the acoustics of water on stone as well that he played around with. The waterfall or sound of bare feet on stone, the constructing of the bathhouse in a way became like an instrument for water. Like the quarry, there's this mystical nature of the world of stone inside a mountain. And there's the use of darkness and light. And whilst we've been talking about material things, I want to come back to this idea of blocks dispersed throughout the site and the impact on circulation. So back in Zumthor's early diagram of dissecting the quarry, it's like the plan is a geometric cave system in the depths of the mountain. And as you come out and through the building, you come towards the daylight at the front. And that the thermal baths appears as it's literally emerged on its own accord from the mountain or the hill, which it's embedded. So I just want to talk about the circulation of this building. So as I mentioned before, there's this discrete entry that you access on the side, almost just carved out of the hill. So what you're actually viewing of the facade is along the bottom. That's what presents back out to the street. But where you enter, you have to climb up a steep embankment to find a tunnel that you can start to come through the various checkpoints into the bathhouse. So the circulation's controlled and self-guided, and one enters the building in one location, checks in and moves down a tunnel, almost like a miner descending into the pits with minimal light. So where I'm indicating that in terms of the arrows of where you enter the building, if we look at it in section, we're way up the top, embedded in the topography of that hill. There's minimal light. So this is the tunnel that you enter. There's minimal light, and the natural spring seeps through the cracks in the wall intentionally, oxidising with the wall surface and ponding on the ground. So you're fully clad as you step into a series of change rooms that are dimly lit and theatrical. In fact, this is actually more light than the day that we went. It was really hard to adjust in terms of the light. It took a while to get used to that space because it's this dark lacquered timber and the minimal amount of light. So at this point, you're embedded in the mountain. You're withheld from any glimpses of the bathhouse, and you're slightly disoriented on your current location in the building and within the landscape. And this sort of is the beginning of your primary experience of bathing, stepping out onto a raised plinth with glimpses to both the internal and external pools in the pool deck and the framed views of the Swiss countryside. So where that dot is, you're up on a higher level, looking down these large, wide steps onto a pool deck. This is a night view. This is up at that elevated view, looking down at the bathers, down at people wandering around, down at those blocks where they have different programs set within it. These are your little framed views, and you're starting to come into the light. What's evident from that first glance is the monolithic stone blocks interrupting the vista. That the bath complex can never reveal itself entirely, and that the occupant needs to descend down the oversized large stone steps and explore a hidden experience contained within the bathhouse, contained within those blocks. As I mentioned earlier, the circulation being controlled and self-guided, there's this continuous internal space. The bather can meander through the bath structure, choosing their own itinerary and pace. I might add, these are our photos. We illegally took a camera in and got told to take it back out. So we got a bit of a mixture of ours as well as journal images. Okay. So the architect had a requirement within the brief to fulfil all the terms of the spa. So as I talked about earlier, these individual blocks where we've got those orange arrows have different singular sensory experiences within them. So for instance, and as you enter, each one has carved into the stone a temperature on it. That's always remains the same. So one is 42, one is 15. So you have the 42-degree pool like a Japanese hot tub. And then you have this sort of icy cold, almost Scandinavian plunge pool. You have one that's like a cave that almost, the way it echoes is like this monastic chanting. One is just a place to drink water, sort of comes in out of the wall. Another is a scented flower bath. So they all have a different use, a different feeling. And then within those spaces, there's a different way you access it. These are some early sketches by the architect. The one on the left is in plan, and the one on the right is in section. It's of the same pod, or the same block. And this is the one where you can drink the water that comes out of the wall. So they're just really simple, purist sketches, simple shifts, simple program put into these spaces. But it's the craft that's interesting. So you just have this bronzed fountain around, like floor waste in the floor, and quite a skinny tunnel to access, to come into that open area, that clearing, to put your hands out to drink the water. It's all about that purity, cleansing. So these spaces consider the body and the placement of the body in different situations. Sitting on stone, lying on your stomach, on your back, going up steps, wading through shoulder-height water to a space that you can't sit in. So there's some more sketches of how you approach this. This is the ice bath. So really it's not a big space because you don't spend very long in an ice bath. So, but everyone's got it like steps, stepping up, stepping down, this sort of long tunnel-like space to come into a clearing. And what you notice also in the section is what's happening with the ceiling. As you're stepping down, the ceiling's going up. These small shifts. So these spaces operate like points on the plan. All right, before I move on, these are just images of the different thresholds you enter these different blocks. So you're stepping down, this is the ice bath. Some you actually don't directly go in. Actually, most you don't go directly in, you turn the corner. You can't actually see what's ahead of you. This is the one that you're actually going into like a cave, but to get into that space you have to wade through in water that's sort of shoulder height, through a tunnel that's not overly big, you know, just you feel like your head could skim the top of it. Some you have to step up into it. But every time with these blocks within the plan, there's a pronounced threshold. And there's a mass around it. It's not just the sort of the thin veil of a door. There is this extruded monolithic threshold to go through, to enter. So these spaces and blocks operate as points on the plan to draw you in, to pause, to engage before returning back out to the larger, more circulation space. It's worth noting that this circulation space, and I guess this is an opposite to what we'll see in the Moriyama house, is an artificial space. So it's internal. It's controlled. Its inside temperature is comfortable and consistent both summer and winter. And so that reaction and engagement to nature is detached. All right. The other main focus is the two larger indoor-outdoor pools. So the square-shaped one is the internal pool, and the one on the left is the outdoor pool. The plan and its internal circulation is centred around the perfectly controlled 30-degree pool. 30 degrees is what the spring of the village is naturally set at. And it's a symmetrical entry points into that pool. So you can descend down the steps into that pool from 4 different placements within the plan. So the pools, and the stone blocks frame the entry to the pool. So we can see different sizes, but they're on each corner of that main pool, and they frame that space. And we get that sense that the bath complex, again, can never reveal itself entirely, that the stone blocks are denying that outward vista. So this is a few views of that internal pool. When I was describing the blocks, they all orient themselves on that corner. So it actually creates a fairly internal, inward-facing central pool. Okay. This is the access. So if I go back, see that orange arrow on the left-hand side coming down and into the outdoor pool? This image here is at the beginning, where you step down in this sort of trench of water to get you to the outdoor pool. So you're inside the bath complex. You step down into this channel of water and then turn the corner, push through, almost like a flap in the building, and you're out into the outdoor pool. But again, you have to wade through water, interact with water, change or go through a series of levels to get to this outdoor pool. And this water is tempered to allow for use all year round. And that reaction of the seasons is only when you actually get outside of the building and your head's sort of bobbing above the water level, you get that ability to understand what you're actually doing and what season you're in, whether it's hot or cold. And you've got that ability to retreat back into the building. So this is obviously a winter image, and you see the steam rising off the water. Right, so this is this is actually like a reflected ceiling plan that we're looking at with this image. And the yellow defines the slot skylights that occur within this building. So the opposite to Moriyama, where we disperse blocks around the site, and where these blocks pull apart, it's actually open and out in the elements. It's a garden. This one is where these blocks pull apart, you're still containing as an internal space. So the dark black, represents those different blocks where we have the different functions occurring. The light grey is the ceiling that's connected to these blocks, and I will talk about the structure in the future. And then where they don't quite touch is a skylight, and light is able to seep through. I'll just talk briefly about the structure of these individual modules. So the top one, well, the structure is massive and thick. It's that monolithic. And the architect developed their own sort of construction style by this four-stage process. And it was almost like building this like jigsaw puzzle pieces in the way that these modules came together, didn't quite touch, and then we have this series of skylights. So the first stage was the interior wall of the bath, or the spa, the interior face of the module. Then this was a non-load-bearing, in-situ concrete poured on site. So that dark white line on the top image. The second was to place steel reinforcing rods around, and then build up the sides with a series of stone, like a veneer on the outside. So what you're doing is creating the formwork. So the formwork is essentially the stone that you see throughout the bathhouse, and you've got the reinforcing steel bars in the centre, and then they pour the concrete in small steps in order not to exert too much pressure on the stone. And once charged, the concrete's in compression. The other feature of the steel bars is the connection to the concrete roof of the module. That's keeping it in tension. And it forms like a cantilevered roof on the top of this module. So like I showed you the reflected ceiling plan a few slides earlier, we're now looking back down at the roof, and we can see that same puzzle pieces coming together. We're looking down at where they pull apart is the skylight. So there's a section detail on the right that shows that glass skylight, and they're the concrete roof coming together but not touching. And also the concrete roof was the ability to inlay grass. So you can imagine you've got the 1960s hotel further up the embankment, looking down to this spa bath, and one of the key brief requirements was that it was not to be visible, not to dominate the view, not to mask the view to the valley. So when you're up at this hotel looking down, this is what you're seeing, is this tapestry of sort of paddocks or fields coming together, stitching together. And it feels like it's part of the whole landscape of that valley. So this is the external view of that technique, and internally this is what it provides as well, is you get wash of light coming from the large windows at the front, but you get these sort of light that leads you through the building daylight, and at night it's illuminated as well, to pull you through to the different points within those blocks dispersed within the site. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to move on to the next case study. Okay, the second of the two case studies, Moriyama House, Tokyo, Japan, by Ru Nishizawa, completed in 2005. So it's an urban context, not a rural location. It's a flat site, not a steep mountain terrain. There's density and consistent form of 3 to 4 stories in height, with narrow laneways. And it's about having a built presence in the city rather than a building in a way that it's not supposed to be seen, like the Vals. In comparing the buildings in simple terms, it's the additive of the Moriyama, and it's the subtractive of the Vals, retreating into the mountain, disguising its location. So it's located, here's some views of it as well. So it's located in the suburbs of Tokyo, in an old residential area where people and buildings are open. You can hear neighbours talking alongside other sort of city noises. A bit about its location. And Moriyama is the client, owned the site, and was requiring for his own residence and a kind of a co-op of other apartments that could be rented out. So there's an element of a single dwelling with a whole lot of multiple tenancies as well. And some of the architect's initial concept sketches found the brief, when integrated, became one excessively large building. That the mass was too big for the corner block and in relation to other buildings, adjoining buildings. So this, you can see this series of sketches, this iteration of taking the brief and dissecting it and pulling it apart. In a way, some of the early sketches what Peter Zumpfer was doing with the idea of taking the quarry and taking the mountain and pulling it apart, and how does that affect program and the disbursement of program. Okay. And as the architect described, I quote, "It felt like a closed building with its interior veiled in mystery, and that the construction didn't fit with the open-mindedness that defined the area." Another one of the architect's sketches, and it's kind of an interesting concept in the way we live too. Now, this is an assumption that everybody lives in a house that under that one roof has kitchen, bathroom, bedrooms embedded in it, which is what that's showing on the left-hand side. And what the architect played around with is, well, what if you take all those functions and put them independently, disperse them around the site, and there is no closed connection. There's no undercover walkway to get to all those different functions. You have to walk to get to the bathroom. You have to go outside. You have to engage in the environment, engage in the seasons. So this is where this notion began of dispersing program around the site, breaking down the plan into sort of 8 individual houses, and essentially a collection of separate volumes that make up the house. And through further iteration, removed another piece of the program, either a kitchen or a bathroom or enclosed veranda, and placed it on the site. Each volume accommodates a different need or function independent of each other. And arriving at the final design is 10 separate buildings. 6 are rented out and 4 form a single residence occupied by the owner. So his house, his private house, is separated into 4 entities within the site. And they range in height from 1 to 3 stories, where every room is a building by itself, and even the owner, Moriyama's bathroom, is a separate building. And that the final design also gives the client, freedom to decide on which part of the cluster of rooms they will use, that they can move it around, that he could choose a different part of the site to live in for a different part, for a different season, that it may switch, a series of living and dining rooms, and that, I guess, the way that that whole site could function will change beyond his existence. The circulation is similar to Val's in that there's one entry point from the ground into these different tenancies. However, because this is not enclosed within a building like Val's, it also creates like laneway access points. So this diagram, what I've done is shown you the actual entry points into the different tenancies, but also the multiple access points from the laneway. So Val's has one entry point, it's quite controlled. This particular site opens itself up to its environment, to its suburb. The individual volumes create a series of individual gardens between them as well. So this one actually shows you plan, but also what's happening in elevation. See how they're stacking, all different heights, as well as just dispersing within the plan. They've got a multitude of different heights. The individual volumes creating these individual gardens, okay? Because now where these blocks pull apart, because they're not contained within one building, they're open to the elements. Where they splinter apart, instead of having like the skylight approach that occurred within Val's, you have this landscape weaving its way through the site. And it becomes a landscape-like building, inviting the occupant to participate and engage in nature. The negative space surrounding the blocks and how many volumes fragmented on the site organise the shape of the garden. So each block or each tenancy has its own private garden, but it's part of the whole community or co-op. And whilst Val's embedded itself in the mountain, and once you were in its environs, you were detached from the changeable nature, Moriyama House, the landscape is threaded through the site. The landscape, city and house becomes one. This is that laneway approach that I was talking about earlier, the way that you can circulate through the site. With the stacking, you start to look down on the landscape below, but you're taking that garden up into the higher levels. Another comparison to the Moriyama House, and this is just a bit more on Japanese architecture and the organisation of the Moriyama House, is if you refer to the row house by Ando, Fusumiyoshi, built in the mid-70s in Japan, and this is a two-storey house. And at the centre was this courtyard. So I'm just making a sort of an analogy to another building now, where this idea of Japanese architecture, where they pull the program apart and make you engage in nature, engage in the environment and the season, by instead of walking down a fully controlled hallway, you actually go out into a courtyard to actually engage with the rest of the house. So the courtyard was the only link between things like the dining room and the living room, the adult's bedroom and the children's room. It was split at ground level. And so moving between the levels and spaces was conducted outside. So you're very aware of that movement. Because in Japan it snows, it gets really cold. So you have to engage in nature, be hyper aware of it. You're aware of the environment, weather, season, and the framed view of the sky. And that the courtyard, with its circulation, becomes the centre of everyday life. Now, another opposite to vowels is the way light comes into these different blocks. So once within one of those blocks or modules within vowels, it was theatrical and dark and dimly lit. It's the opposite in Moriyama. It's bathed in light. You've got framed views to the city around you. So every room has a window, and the window is carefully offset with the neighbour's space. So none of these windows have blinds, except for the bathhouse, except for the bathroom. So you're aware when the sun comes up and the sun goes down. And the other thing about the Moriyama house that's different to vowels is that the occupant is allowed to move freely horizontally and vertically. They're able to do that in nature rather than in a controlled environment. The other thing is the transparency. We were talking a lot about monolithic structure and style. This is about transparency, where you can see through different modules into another. So what we're looking at now is looking at a dining room module, an enclosed veranda, as they call it, through to the bathroom. The bathroom being the only one that you actually can draw a curtain. Stacking occurred with the use of materials in vowels, but they used the additive or the stacking considerably in the Moriyama house with the use of three-storey structures where they stack program, i.e. like where you've got the bathroom and toilet at the basement, living and dining at the mid-level, and then bedroom on the upper level. Therefore, all the fundamental spatial units in a traditional Japanese house are stacked on top of each other. And with Vals, the bathers are dwarfed by the towering proportions within the modules or the bathing blocks, sitting in them, gazing up to the ceiling. But it's one complete space. You don't move up into it vertically. Whereas the Moriyama house, the occupant is allowed to climb up into it. So the architect came up with this sort of new definition of private and community living. And he also played around with this flexible format of minimalist steel prefab. And the structure of the buildings, the prefab houses, are only 60 millimetres thick, so quite the opposite to the bathhouse, with these extremely thin walls reinforced with steel plates, white steel plates. And the use of the steel plating makes the walls thin, obviously, but it also maximises the interior space. And to that, I guess that idea of attempting to remove the material from architecture, the opposite of Vals, where it was quite pronounced. It was about dealing with a quartzite that was locally quarried from that particular site. This is about removing materiality. In the Moriyama house, the materials seem to become more or less absent. And this absence creates a timeless approach or a neutral spatial quality. And it's not necessarily open or closed. It sort of disappears. Unlike the thermal valves with the inward-facing interiors and the crafted materials and the monolithic, weighty structures, the Moriyama house shows an intention to absorb its context by transparency and the absence of materials. So, like I mentioned at the start, we've got two contemporary buildings, built and designed with two different requirements, with different programs and briefs that show probably opposites more than similarities. But they dealt with a similar idea of dispersing volumes and space across the site, and how this disbursement of individual volumes creates circulation and negative spaces, and how two architects, I guess, utilise the approach of this technique. What happens to that larger continuous space? What happens with the smaller enclosed intimate internal space? And I guess what happens with the singular elements yet part of a whole. Okay? That's it. Any questions?
You know, how many residents the Moriyama house is? Is there like a set number of?
Six.
Six.
And it's a changeable thing. Sorry, there's 6 residents. It possibly could take a couple within that, but yeah. But that's how it works, and it's a changeable thing that they keep moving around depending on the balance of that. Depending on how much the client wants to take of other parts of the site for himself. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Okay, I don't even know what the time is. 5 minutes to 10. We'll see you up at the tutorial in about 5 minutes. Sorry, no one's allowed to. No one's allowed to. I told James to leave immediately. I said, I will do a lecture, but you're not allowed to sit in it. It's my rule. So, anyway, you'll see it. Yeah, have a little laugh.
texts at like 9:05 and like maybe you'll over here. I'm like, yeah.